Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. I come to you today after quite a while away from BookTube, while I've been recovering from shoulder surgery and also experiencing what I'm going to call interrupted reading. My reading had been affected even before surgery, just from the discomfort I was going through from the injury. When Steve Donahue asked me to come up with a list of questions for him to discuss with his book reviewer friend Sam Sachs a few months ago, my disrupted reading was what was on my mind. I decided to ask some questions that were a little broader than just disrupted reading, though, more about changes or shifts in our reading. And many of those shifts in our reading have been positive. I came up with a list of questions for Steve and Sam, but I'm realizing now that I'd love to hear all of your answers. So I've turned it into an official tag, the Reading Shifts tag, and I thought I'd introduce you to the questions today. The questions are all about the various ways our reading changes over time, both changes in what we read and how we read, even whether we've experienced times when we haven't read at all. Those questions are, in general, big thought questions that won't require you to pull books off the shelf. In fact, right now, pulling a lot of books off the shelf is still rather hard for me. At any rate, while you're welcome to mention specific books throughout, only the final question really requires a discussion of a specific book. So let me go through all the questions and give you my own responses. The first one is, how has your reading developed over your lifetime? Do the kind of books that bring you the most pleasure now differ from the kinds of books you loved much earlier in your life? If you've seen changes in your reading since you've matured, what might explain your changing interests? I haven't seen enormous changes in my pleasure reading of fiction, but I have in my reading of nonfiction. Let me explain. Starting when I was about 12 years old or so, I loved reading Victorian classics, as well as 19th century and early 20th century American fiction. I have a special place in my heart for 20th century literature from the U.S. South. I was a bit older, perhaps college age, before I started enjoying more modernist fiction, but it's been a long time now that that's been important to me too. As a younger person, I also read a ton of mysteries and a fair bit of fairly contemporary fiction, often by women authors and sometimes by newer Southern writers as well. I do a little less of that now than I used to. For many years, my nonfiction reading revolved around school. I studied history in college and graduate school, and then became a professor who needed to keep up with my field of study. Much of what I read was in my particular subject matter, although I tried to keep up with the trends in the larger field of history. It was a time when theory was becoming more connected to historical analysis, and I absolutely loved thinking about these new kinds of questions, even when I more or less dismissed many of the main theoretical texts on the grounds that while they had interesting things to say, they needed good editors. Actually, these big questions have been rattling around in my head for the last few days because of the last few videos I saw over at Bryn's channel about his connections and disconnections with academia. I think he's inspired me to make not a response, because I'm not quite addressing his questions, but a video tangent. Is there such a thing? Anyway, after I left teaching, I tried to continue to keep up with my feels, and I still do, although to a far less serious level. Now it's because I pay my bills by doing some editing work for academics. So I need to know that basic shape of recent scholarship, but not with the kind of specificity or detail that I needed back when I was still teaching or writing my own work. Now I read more popular nonfiction in general. I read a lot of memoirs, which I'll talk about a little more in another question coming up. And I've completely fallen in love with biographies of authors. That started happening before I found BookTube, but not by much. And certainly BookTube led me further down that rabbit hole. And when I started reviewing books for Open Letters Review and other venues, I felt most comfortable talking about that kind of book. something totally outside my academic interest. So I wouldn't fall into writing academic style reviews, but something not totally unrelated to the type of archival research and presentation I kind of understood from practicing history. So similar, but also quite different. Question 2. Do you find yourself choosing different kinds of books at different periods of the year? For example, do the seasons affect what you read for pleasure? And similarly, might you read very different kinds of books while on vacation? I don't think they did before BookTube. I suppose back in college, I probably spent the week between wrapping up final exams and the start of working a summer job by reading casual mysteries or some kind of cozy beachy thing. I don't quite remember anything specifically. Now, though, seasons do matter, and it's because of BookTube. My mind cannot imagine getting through the autumn, especially October, without obsessing about the Victorians, or making it through July without some Jane Austen. March with no mammoths, August with no Faulkner, September without Shakespeare and also art, etc. Number 3, do specific experiences in your life ever shape what you choose to read? For example, did you read obsessively about child rearing when your kids were little, like I did? Or about gardening when spring is either too far away, as it is now, or about to begin? About the experience of grief when someone you love has died? This kind of thing has defined much of my reading of memoirs for the last 2+ decades. I read obsessively about childbirth and baby care, about education, especially young education, since we found ourselves homeschooling, which is a long story in itself. About the experience of serious illness, twice from the perspective of a patient and once from the perspective of a caregiver. About grief when my spouse and then my mother died the same year. Shoulder surgery has not, to my knowledge, inspired any great literature, so perhaps I'm over this streak. The 4th question. Have there been any times in your life when circumstances have limited or changed your reading in some way? Perhaps caretaking responsibilities, or a big move that made it hard to find as much time to read as you'd like, or hard to find the books you want to read, or personal illness that made it hard to concentrate, or maybe just long-term travel that might have limited your book choices. How do you deal with these circumstances? Some of the events I mentioned in the previous question interfered with the time I had to read, as well as the energy and concentration I could muster at particular times. When I went through chemotherapy, it definitely left me too zonked to do any serious reading, although I did love hearing my spouse read aloud to me. And then caring for him after he got sick definitely took it out of me too, although the times when I could focus on books were healing in a way that nothing else was. On this channel during that period, I mentioned the book Late Migrations by Margaret Rinkle. It had a profound impact on me right then. But in both of those situations, caregiving and going through chemotherapy, I knew I would get my reading groove back at some point. Earlier in my life, earlier in graduate school actually, I had surgery for a large but non-cancerous brain tumor, and the surgery had some pretty profound impacts on my intellectual and physical abilities for quite a while. It took me almost a year to be able to read in any way like I had before. I worked with an occupational therapist for a while, but reading did come back after a lot of really hard work. One of the first novels I made it through was Jane Smiley's 1,000 Acres. My job was to read one of the very short chapters, once to myself and then once aloud, every day. Some of the chapters were just a paragraph or two. It was tremendously hard work, but slowly it got easier and easier to read, and then suddenly books were back as a way to entertain myself and soothe myself sometimes, and even to educate myself again. Question 5. BookTube is full of discussions of reading slumps, when dedicated readers seem to lose interest for a while in books. Sometimes they just can't find a book that appeals to them. Have you ever experienced a reading slump? If so, how did you handle it? If not, do you have any advice to give people who are experiencing slumps? I don't think I've ever had a normal book slump. The post illness interruptions were really quite enough. Number 6, booktubers also talk about book hangovers, when readers are so moved by a book that they find it difficult to move on to a new book. Have you ever felt this way? There have been at least a dozen books that I felt like I had to read for a second time, or even a third time, before I could quite move on to something else. One was neurosurgeon Paul Kalanithe's When Breath Becomes Air, about his diagnosis and eventual death from lung cancer. I read it before my spouse's diagnosis with brain cancer, and afterwards read it again and again. A happier book that I had to sit with for a while was a fairly recent read for me, something I read for the first time just a couple of years ago, Sarah Orne Jewett's gorgeous The Country of Pointed Firs. Afterwards, I spent the following months tracking down, with Steve Donahue's assistance as my brattle whisperer, a few related biographical and analytical works. In fact, I really thought about whether I was up for trying to write a book about her, and finally decided that one of the books I had just read already had done a better job than I thought I could do. Okay, the final substantive prompt is to finish up by talking about a few books that almost always work for you. Something that might have remained a favorite throughout your life, despite any changing reading taste. Something that always seems to hit just the right spot when you need a lift, or perhaps some lifetime book hangover where the text will always be at the back of your mind. My first answer is quite predictable, and those of you who have been waiting for me to make my regular mention of Charlotte Bronte can now have a sip of your drink. Jane Eyre is absolutely the book that lives inside me, which I think of every day or so and either read in full or dip into for short or long periods quite often. But there are others. For example, Flannery O'Connor and Eudora Welty, authors I fell in love with as a teenager and then eventually taught to young people for several years at, quote, nerd camp in North Carolina. So many of the phrases from those stories I know best feel like they are part of my own speech now, even though they came merely from reading them. Another book that might be far less obvious is a relatively little-known work of academic social history that I read right as I was deciding to become an historian myself, and that's Stephen Stow's book Intimacy and Power in the Old South. I haven't read it in decades, but it helped shape my thinking about how to pore through primary sources like diaries and letters and learn information that more traditional historians might not have thought to consider. At this point, the echoes of that book circling around in my brain have more to do with how I felt about the book at the time I read it than they do about the book itself. Okay, that will do it. And the only thing left to do is to tag people. I'm going to tag a bunch of folks down in the description box, but also try to leave lots of channels untagged, just so you'll have a chance to pass it along yourselves. And of course, you needn't ever wait to be tagged if you're interested in participating. You are absolutely invited to answer this and any other tag, whether you've been specifically tagged by someone or not. I'd love to hear your responses. And if you don't have a channel of your own, or you would just prefer to do it this way, you can absolutely participate down in the comments for any or all of the questions. Thanks for joining me today. See you soon here on Hannah's Books.